Okay, we're back. Hope it was a good break. Let's, before we go over into the book of Ruth, let's go over to 1 Peter chapter 4. Let's take a look at some things that are going on here. All right. In chapter 4, verse 1, it says that for as much as the Messiah hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin. This is huge, okay? Because the covering of the kinsman redeemer, the covering of the apostles, notice that when those tongues of fire went over their head, they lost all fear. They didn't care. They weren't worrying about getting knocked off or beat up or imprisoned or any of that stuff. The scriptures are replete with the miraculous seeing them set free, being saved from shipwrecks, prisons, and everything until God's purposes were accomplished. But they did it with no fear because they understood the covering. They understood here that when you go through these things, and what happened to the Messiah, he died. All right, so there was no potential occasion for sin because anybody can sin. When we die, all right, when we change that flesh, we're no longer fighting a battle against sin. So listen in verse 2, and that's a big thing, that it says that he no longer should live the rest of time in the flesh, okay, to the lusts of men, but to the will of God instead. Now, when we see this, we have to understand that no longer living in the flesh means that we're changed. Remember, we talked about being changed last week, the transfiguration, all right? You cannot be in the presence of God in the flesh. So, of course, being in the Spirit and being born in the Spirit in the presence of God means you're without sin. There's no more sin, sickness, or death in that dimension with God. So recognize these things. Because it even says here further, it says, for in the times past, life may suffice to have wrought the will of the Gentiles. When we walked in the lasciviousness and lust and the excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries, this is when the world is happy with you. Same thing that we're seeing today in society. A million people feel this way. One person feels, oh, I'm offended by that. And the whole world turns upside down. All right? Because when you go against the things that are wrong, you become a target. It's a way of assuaging their own guilt. All right? Excise you from the whole equation. Get rid of you. You don't think like we do. Okay? That's what's going on here. Same thing. If you're not, look at yourself. Some people, they come to God, they go really overboard, and sometimes they really need to because they understand the weakness of their own character, all right? How easy it is to fall back into bad habits, how easy it is to go back out and get drunk all the time, to have lust, excesses of wine, lasciviousness, all of these things, idolatries. Once you break them, you start falling into a pattern. So he's saying if you're out of the flesh and in the spirit, whether you're dead or alive, you still have the opportunity to push away and walk away from sin. Because it says as we go further, it says, who shall give an account to him that is ready to judge the quick and the dead? That's God. You got to give an account for our behavior, all right? We have to understand that, okay? And we're told again, now we talk about this compassion, all right? Listen to what it says here. In verse 7 of chapter 4, it says, but the end of all things is at hand. All right? We're being told it's coming. Be ye therefore sober and watch and pray unto prayer. And above all these things have a fervent charity or a loving compassion, as we talked about earlier, among yourselves, for charity shall cover, that is, love shall cover a multitude of sins. A multitude of sins. So now we have to discuss and think about, well, what is this charity that we're talking about? Okay? In the Greek, it's easy. It's the word agape. It's love. Charity is loving kindness. Technically, that's what it is. Okay? Charity is the Greek agape. In the Hebrew, it's the word sadeka, which means actually righteousness. Okay? That's a very important understanding. And this righteousness falls upon us as good stewards. It says in verse 9, use hospitality one to another without grudging. All right? As every man hath received the gift, so minister the same gift one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. We have to actually do something with this, all right? We have to do something. Because it says in verse 14, if you be reproached for the name of the Messiah, be happy about it, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. That's a covering, just like in Isaiah 11:1. The rod shall come forth out of Jesse, and it says that he's covered with the spirit of wisdom and truth. Okay? That's the same thing that we're talking about here. And it says, resist or rests upon you. That's what the covering is. And when we go back to the kinsman redeemer in a few, we're going to see this same thing. But it says, let none of you suffer as a murderer or as a thief or an evildoer or a busybody. Because it says, if you suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on his behalf. Now, suffering means to actually die. If you die as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, without having that reconciliation with the Spirit of God, we got a problem. All right, because it says, for the time to come, that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begins at us, what shall the end of those be that do not obey this gospel of God? What will their fate be? Because it says in verse 19, the last verse, it says, wherefore let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to him in well-doing, as unto a faithful Creator. Remember that song back in 1972, Put Your Hand in the Hand of the Man Who Stills the Waters. All right, it was a song about basically putting your hand in the hand of God, allowing him to hold our hand, okay? Allowing him to do what he would do for us, all right? And oftentimes we just don't. We just don't. We walk in our own ways, as we know that we have in days past, okay? So we really have to start thinking about how to reconcile all of this, how to reconcile all of it and put it together. So, and we look, let's say, let's go to Colossians chapter 2, verse 1 through 3, just to recap again, going back toward the things we talk about in Revelation, okay? It says, for I would that you knew what the great conflict that is I have for you. Now remember, we just read about that. And for them at Laodicea, which means the people's rights. And for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh, that their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love. Here it is, the same thing, loving kindness, tender mercies. And unto all the riches of the full assurance of the understanding, the acknowledgement of the mystery of God. Remember in Revelation we said the entire mystery of God will be revealed. All right, here it's being alluded to, and of the Father and of the Messiah, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. How often we've spoken of wisdom, okay? In the Hebrew, the word is teshuvah, okay? And it means packing away the treasures, hiding the treasures of wisdom and knowledge from those who do not live according to what God has asked us to do. All right? And therein lies the agonizomai, or the struggle that we have, the conflict, okay? And And this is why we really need to get a hold of all this whole concept. All right. We get a portrait of the Messiah, we get a portrait of the Godhead bodily, and we understand, the head of all principalities and power as God. But yet, we play our silly games and we do what we do, which is basically creating our own moral code, as we said last week, instead of really, getting an understanding. All right? Getting an understanding. We're asked in Colossians verse 3, chapter 12, he said, put on therefore as the elect of God, all right, holy and beloved, put on bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness and long suffering, forgiving one another as the Messiah forgave us, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. This is what we're told to do. Let the word of the Messiah, which is the word of love, dwell in you richly in all wisdom, which we've spoken in depth about. So, letting that kind of set the tone and the pattern, we're told to have faith, hope, and charity, which is the greatest of all of these. So we know what faith is, trusting in the truthfulness of God's word, especially as it relates to the Messiah, which all of it does. Then we have this word hope, all right, tikva, all right, is hope. It's an expectation that we are convinced is the accomplishment of God's promises for all of us and in our individual lives, okay? And it's something that we're told to eagerly wait for. Wait for God to respond. He doesn't make idle promises, because it's the one thing that's immutable, unchangeable, is that God cannot lie, okay? Satan is called the father of lies. So he has this part, God has God's part. So, and of the greatest of these three is charity, okay? It's charity. And it's very important for us to understand that. So let's go on. Back to our kinsman redeemer. We talked about the living relative. We talked about in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10 specifically, and I want to read it one more time as we move forward into that, where we're going. Verse 10 says, all right, which in times past you were not a people, but now you're the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. So in speaking to Israel, all right, physical Israel, he's saying, you received mercy. Now give it. Give out what you received. Okay. So now, getting back to the kinsman redeemer, let's go to, in our Bibles, to Ruth, chapter 3, verse 9. There's a couple very interesting statements made here. The word or the title kinsman is used 12 times in the book of Ruth. Now we know that 12 is the number of authority in the Bible, okay? Notice the following phrase in Ruth 3, verse 9. Spread thy skirt. Curious, isn't it? Spread thy skirt. What does that mean? I'll tell you what it means in ancient Hebrew. This was a symbolic act of protection and of covering. It was also a very definite act of providing protection in a marital sense. The skirt of his robe is not a skirt like you would think of. In the ancient Judaism, meant throwing the prayer shawl, the talit, which covers us. Throwing that over the head of a woman was an outward sign of solemnizing, making it solemn, a marriage. When you put that covering, that's what it says in the New Testament. So, of course, the churches said, oh, women have to come in with a covering on their head, and they wore kerchiefs, hats, this, that, and the third. Ridiculous. Gave birth to the whole nonsense of the elaborate, grotesque, in fact, in the 60s and on, hats that women wore on Easter. Oh, they had to make a big show of it. The covering. It has nothing to do with it. The covering is this. This is the covering they were talking about. That the cover over a woman's head was that. See, no longer twain, but one flesh, one mind, one spirit. That's the community. That's what the solemnizing, I hate to say that word, I get tongue-tied, of bringing together man and wife as equals. But one has oversight because of the duties of the husband. And that duty is to protect the wife. Don't get me wrong, the wife protects the husband too, but in different ways. And in Judaism, this covering, all right, putting the talit over the head of the woman was symbolic of making a marriage and casting it and memorializing it forever. That's how you got married back then. It wasn't no big elaborate scheme with this, that, and this paper and go to the judge and do this and that, government getting involved. Who needs it? So that's what this was. Now, I think we can understand, again, as I said, what Paul meant when having a woman, her head covered, is to stop the silly conjecture of all that nonsense that's been preferred over the centuries. All right, a woman's covering, especially in a synagogue or church, is that of the spiritual covering of her husband, her goel. It is not about hats and kerchiefs. All right, so anyway, back to the story. The goel, in this case, was Boaz. Now, he had sought out Ruth's own nearest kin relative, all right? And upon finding him, it became quickly apparent that Ruth's immediate relative, who had the obligation that he could decline to cover or marry his brother's wife, he didn't want anything to do with Ruth, but he would be glad to take the inheritance of the land, which he did. So I wonder if that sounds familiar to his readers out there. You got to think about that one. What would we do? And so Ruth, by the way, interestingly enough, was a Moabitess. She's from Moab, Edom, okay? And we're going to talk more about that because just because she was from Moab, let's not get a little crazy and say, well, why would Boaz, and Boaz's name, by the way, Jachin and Boaz were the two names of the two pillars in the temple that kept the porticos in the Hebrew temple standing, like big column pillars. So Boaz has a lot going on here. And, if we look in the Gospel of John in the 4th chapter, we can see about the woman in the well. She was a Samaritan. So for Boaz to marry a Moabitess was not any more of a great deal than the Messiah to engage directly with a Samaritan woman. All right? It says when Yeshua had to go through Samaria after leaving Judea to go back to Galilee, he came to Samaria in a town Sychar near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And there was Jacob's well was there. And it was around the 6th hour in the afternoon, a woman comes from Samaria to draw water, and Jesus says to her, "Give me to drink. Give me a drink." And the disciples were gone in the city to buy meat, and he said, a woman of Samaria says to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, asks me to give you a drink? I'm a woman of Samaria, and the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans at all." But Messiah answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it was that says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you wouldn't have asked him, you would have just given me the water, the living water." And she said, "Well, you don't even have anything to draw with. And the well's deep, from whence then hast thou living water?" And he says to her, "Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well?" She says to him, "And drank for it himself and his children and his cattle." And Messiah says to her, "Whoever drinks of the water that is going to get thirsty again. But the water I'm talking about, the living water, is going to be that springs up into everlasting life." The woman says to him, "Sir, I would like this water. I thirst not, but neither come hither to draw. But this water I would want." And he says, "Well, go call thy husband and come hither." She says, "Well, I don't have a husband." He says, "Yeah, I know. You said it well. You spoke the truth. I know you don't have a husband. And you've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with now is not even your husband. And she just said, whoa. The woman says, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this place, and they say that Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. All right. But this well was in Mount Gerizim. All right. And the woman now says, he says to her, Woman, believe me, the hour comes when you shall not, neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem, worship the Father. It ain't going to come down like that. You worship what you don't even know. But we, the Jews, it says in verse 22, know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. Period. I don't care who doesn't like that today. The church is rife with anti-Semitism. The hour comes, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father, listen again, in spirit and in truth. We keep hearing this. Wisdom, in spirit, in truth, righteousness, all the same stuff. Because it says God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. All right? The woman says, I know that you are the Messiah, which is called the Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. And Yeshua says to her, I that speak to you am. I am. So any conjecture about how Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, never claimed to be anything, you need to go back and read John 4, because that's exactly what he says. Exactly. No conjecture. All right. Back to our story. We have a couple minutes left. We might finish one, and then we're going to dig into that Ezekiel stuff next week like you wouldn't believe and come back and forth. But for the rest of the night, let's go here. So the Goel in this case, again, was Boaz. He had sought out Ruth's nearest kin relative, and like I said, the guy didn't want anything to do with her. So Boaz became her Goel. Now, Boaz means, in Hebrew, he will strengthen. Ruth, on the other hand, means satisfied. So what a picture of God's provision. But we're not finished yet. You see, they were both descendants of Yeshua. He was a direct descendant of both of them. Their son Obed, whose name means serving, all right, was the father of Jesse, who was the father of King David. You see the lineage. In fact, one of the pillars in David's son's temple was named Boaz, okay? He was strengthened. Holding up the temple itself was the notion of the Redeemer, the kinsman, holding up the temple. That's what he did. In Ruth chapter 4, the word redeem is used 7 times. We know the 7 is a number of completeness and divine and spiritual perfection. And just as Ruth was complete in Boaz, together as one, no longer twain but one flesh, we are complete in our Goel, our Redeemer, our kinsman Redeemer, Yeshua, whose means salvation. Goel means ransom or purchase. Its usage emphasizes a redemptive buying and a privileged duty that proclaims that the Goel lives, and in his flesh he would see God. So here it is that during the gleaning of the harvest, okay, this is when Ruth was brought to Boaz's attention. Well, the gleaning of the harvest. So, look at this. During the gleaning of the harvest, the time leading up to Shavuot. By the way, Shavuot 2022 is today, Thursday, June 2nd. So the message is timely. And it was during this gleaning and gathering of the full harvest, okay, that Ruth was brought to Boaz's attention. He will strengthen and she will be satisfied. You see, if we're tenderhearted and compassionate toward our fellows and our brethren, as Boaz was to Ruth, as Yeshua is to us, then our love may just bring them into the Lord's harvest, the gathering. The harvest is plenteous, but the labors are few. The redeemed, Ruth, says to the Redeemer, Boaz, listen, whither thou goest, I will go. Now we go back to Revelation for a second. In Revelation 14:4 says, quote, they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, listen now, being the firstfruits unto God and unto the Lamb. That's the harvest that we spoke of in Revelation. The gathering, the separating of the wheat from the chaff. It's really not that hard to figure out. So the significance here with the Feast of Weeks, the waiting, counting the Omer, waving the blessing that we have reaped from the earth. God is now doing the soul harvest, all right, with the power of the Spirit. He's gathering right now as we speak. When I say time is of the essence and things are moving quickly, and I give you these examples and you see everything that's going on in the world, and now we're reading about them in books and everything else and news reports, folks, be careful. There's a lot of disinformation out there. I had a discussion with somebody the other day who thought I was from a different planet because I said the Ukraine will fall. Ukraine rather, not the Ukraine. And you got to recognize that all of the wonderful things that they're trying to say that Ukraine is doing, well, doing some of them, but remember, that's a disinformation thing so to discourage the Russians too. In reality, Time magazine wrote an article yesterday about Ukraine's in a heck of a lot worse shape than people know. Okay, they've lost 10 to 20% of their total force, which is only 250,000 people. They've been given hundreds of millions of dollars in support from 31 different countries. But the fact is that these people are overwhelmed. They have no training. And for the United States, our State Department, others, even when we sell to foreign nationals and preferred nation status in NATO, we're not allowed to sell them the training. Little known fact. So they got to find out themselves. Usually this training on some of these systems takes 16 weeks. That's 4 months. You'd think they were going to hold out for 4 months. A lot of stuff is old and doesn't work. Just like Putin's. He's getting rid of garbage. He doesn't care. People talk about, oh, the Russians lost their number one ship, and blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? They're not telling you, but Ukraine lost their entire Navy already. You got to be careful what you hear out there. But the sense of urgency is that these things are happening. The harvest is now happening. God is indwelling and bringing the people. So this message is timely for our Shavuot. And we're supposed to be mindful all the time of this. Shavuot, by the way, is one of the pilgrimage festivals where the Israeli-born men need to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. All right? So that's all part of what's going on. Now, follow our Goel. Follow the Goel is a mandate. Follow Yeshua, our Savior. The number 14 is the number of deliverance, and the number 4 is the number of creation. God wants to deliver his creation and redeem them as a kinsman from the danger. Let's learn the way of Philippians 1:7, which says, even as it is meet for me to think this of you, because I have you in my heart. All right? I have you in my heart. Inasmuch as both in my bonds and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you are all partakers of my grace. Stay in the word. We got to learn to be tenderhearted with loving kindness and compassion in all that we do. Is it hard? Yeah, it's hard. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it. But done well, it will take the black and gray clouds out of your life. Let the light of the Son of the Messiah shine on you. All right? As the song says, shine, Yeshua, shine. Shine your grace on us. So that's the message of the kinsman redeemer. In brevis, I didn't go big deep on a lot of it because we go big deep on everything else. But the important takeaway here is, right, it says in 1 Peter 1:20, being born again, not of corruptible seed, but of incorruptible by the word of God that lives and abides in us forever. For flesh is like grass, and its glory of man will blow away. But the word of the Lord endures forever. And this is the word which by the gospel is preached to you. So, we finished that part this week. Next week, prepare. It's going to be long and involved, but it's going to be very interesting in seeing that, once again, the picture of everything that God's doing. We're going to be looking at Ezekiel 16 next week. It's a long chapter. Go read it, take a look at it, think about it. God bless till next week. Stay well. Peace.